Business Now is brought to you by the Information Technology Association of America. Business development, networking, and public policy leadership for today's IT industry. And cooperation with the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and Maryland Public Television.
Welcome to Business Now Capital Edition. I'm Gary Nierenberg with another report on how the private sector is solving problems for Uncle Sam and at the same time powering continued dramatic economic growth in the greater Washington-Baltimore area. Since 9/11, government increasingly has turned to private industry to overcome major security challenges. Modern warfare and homeland security is becoming more about information, data, and IT instead of weapons. Safeguarding critical data to help our troops and protect our borders is essential to making homeland security a tangible and practical reality. And whether a disaster is caused by terrorists or acts of nature, the private sector has developed services and goods to help protect critical data for enterprises from the Pentagon to Wall Street. Today, we'll look at two cases reflecting the growing partnership between the public and private sector, which is providing answers to a whole new set of concerns that developed as a result of 9/11, the bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma City, anthrax scares, and Katrina. First, a look into the future and a cultural change in our national security. A security measure that had strong bipartisan support immediately after 9/11 has been receiving new, considerable media mention. You guessed it, a federal ID. Consider this. Every terrorist known to be involved in 9/11 had several real or counterfeit state driver's license IDs that provided many benefits we normally don't think about. Everything from banking to buying guns, land, air, and sea travel, and even lessons to fly commercial airplanes. To limit this abuse, a bill for a federal ID was drafted, but concerns over personal privacy and debate over funding have meant years between conception and reality. While addressing these issues over the next 10 years, Americans will begin carrying a real ID card. It will not be a national identification card, but to help safeguard America, Congress turned to technology experts to develop a real identity card. For a spirited discussion of real ID, we assembled a panel of experts for our TechTalk roundtable, moderated by the President and CEO of the Information Technology Association of America, Phil Bond.
Consider these facts. Every one of the terrorists on 9/11 received a state-issued identification under false pretenses. Last year, the Federal Trade Commission received 250,000 complaints about identity theft. And every year in every state, an untold cost in human terms related to underage drinking based again on fake ID. The common thread in all cases, in fact, state-issued, insecure identification. Recently, questions have arisen in Congress, legitimate questions, questions about privacy, questions about cost. What will it cost the states to enact these new driver's licenses? Meanwhile, the Department of Homeland Security is getting ready to issue new standards in regards to the new Real ID. Today, we discuss that with a great panel. Joining me for discussion here, Henry Horton, a partner in IBM's Global Business Services, Ari Schwartz with the Center for Democracy and Technology, Assistant Secretary Dr. Richard Barth from the Department of Homeland Security, and from Northern Virginia, Congressman Tom Davis. Real ID, not as far along as the legislation envisioned at this point in time. A lot of politics, a lot of policy. What's the story? What's the holdup?
Well, you're asking big government to implement it, and by the time you get through all the notice requirements, all the hearings, all the responses, it's just taken a long time to get the initial regulations set up so that you can tell the states how to proceed. In the meantime, it's pushing up against a deadline. There is basically a blanket extension for states that need it, but we still find about 20 states just progressing just very quickly and getting this thing moving.
It sounds like there are some real concerns out there too.
Well, there are, but a lot of it's just jockeying over cost. There is a huge startup cost for anything like this, and nobody wants to pay it. And I've got to believe that some of the states are just as languishing out there, not wanting to move ahead and seeing if they can get some money from the federal government to get it started. And I think some will be forthcoming.
Assistant Secretary Barth, you're on point here over at DHS.
Implementation is, as the Congressman says, not really a skill set of big government, but we think we're putting together the right team and working with the right partners in the individual states as well as with the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators to make sure that we've got systems in place to allow states that want to opt in to actually come on board with a live system for Real ID by the May 11th, 2008 deadline for initial implementation.
Do we even know how much it is at this point?
Nobody knows what it is.
I was going to say the partnership angle as well is very, very important. So you have 56 different jurisdictions, 56 different systems, 56 different ways of governing this implementation. So the idea of vetting that beyond just the financial situation is also very important. So as the department moves out, as the implementation moves out, how do you do it, and how do you do it in a manner that is going to be compliant to achieve the goals and the objectives of the Act? I think that's another action or another way that this kind of slowed things down.
Well, I think that there's sort of a disconnect on where we stand on the privacy issues. You have members of Congress saying that Real ID protects privacy. You have DHS saying that the law does not allow them to set minimum standards for privacy. So there's a disconnect there.
Of course we want to protect privacy, and we think with the biometrics and things available today, it's much easier to do this. We just didn't want to overprescribe. One of the difficulties in Congress is when we overprescribe these issues and technology changes, we end up being behind the curve. Remember, these are state driver's licenses, so at the end of the day, the states set their standards.
Viewers here in the Baltimore, Washington, Northern Virginia area may not understand exactly what that legislation said. Is it a mandate from the federal government that the states must do this?
It says if state driver's licenses are going to be used for federal purposes, crossing the border, getting on an airplane, these issues, it has to meet a certain standard. But if states don't want to comply with this and they just want to issue driver's license to whomever and wherever, that's fine, but those residents of those states are not going to be able to use those driver's licenses to get on a plane. They'll have to use a passport or something else. But we think at the end of the day, the pressure to conform is going to be so great that just every state should probably comply with this.
And certainly that brings you scale and a bunch of other things from the technology side.
Absolutely, absolutely. The scalability, the privacy architecture, separate from the security architecture, is going to be a very important factor. But the idea that a lot of the objectives that the Real ID Act actually has that's called out is probably a good idea just for pure efficiencies and effectiveness and counter fraud. There's a lot of other benefits that the states will achieve from this.
The state of California has for years been collecting thumbprints of people applying for a driver's license. We're not going to require that for all Americans who get a Real ID driver's license, but that state wants to do that, and that's an excellent additional feature of a California state driver's license. The state of New Jersey, in a recent conference out in California, made it clear that they were going to move towards an RFID chip-enabled document, which could then be used for other purposes within the state, and they felt that was an important component of that driver's license.
So let me tease that out a little bit. So you talk about biometrics, you talk about RFID. It begins to sound a lot like the HSPD 12 card that federal employees are going to be carrying around soon. Is that where we're going?
We have a rational number of cards used for a rational number of purposes. Right now, the department, as I'm told, has the mandate to issue roughly 20 different forms of identity. I happen to, from the day I walked into the department, believe that's a nutsy situation that we have to address.
What does that sound like to you, Ari?
Not necessarily a concern. I mean, if a state wants to go forward and really try and get the privacy and security right, using a smart card, using the HSPD 12, the FIPS 201 standard from NIST, in order to do that, we'd encourage that, but it would really have to meet strong privacy and strong security guidelines.
For folks in the Baltimore to DC area.
But you can count at a minimum by the end of 2009 of having of people who go in and get their new driver's license, having to wait in line at least one time to do it. You're going to have to, once again, anew, show your citizenship papers or your legal papers, and that's going to hold up lines a little bit. So at the implementation of this, it's going to be a little bit clumsy and a little longer lines than we would have had otherwise. But that's the price we pay, you know, if we're going to fight terrorism and comply with the 9/11 reports.
I think that the basic outline of that renewal process, which is that you will have to reappear in person and validate who you are every 16 years, is a pretty liberal standard. And I don't see that as being something that we tighten down to every 2 years you have to go back in again.
Sure. I mean, it's not a national ID because they're all a little bit separate and they're all going to be used a little bit differently. But there are minimum standards.
And that's the hot button, I think. One of the hot buttons politically is the national ID card. What's the sense of your colleagues in Congress? Do they see this as having that potential?
Well, you know, when I came to Congress 13 years ago, national ID, all of the privacy groups, everybody was against it. I think it's evolved where the public opinion now recognizes there needs to be some form of identification. But this will be, a driver's license will be an identification you can use almost anywhere.
Well, it's one driver, one record.
Right.
You know, that type of thing, and the states can share that. And that'll cut down, way down on the fraud and multiple driver's license from one person getting multiple driver's license across the country. Basically, as the states adopt this, and we start to see these minimum standards come into place that the Congressman was talking about, those things come into place, the states actually will start to see other benefits in the fact that they can use this Real ID for other features within their state. I think people are missing the point that there are some initial startup costs of any project that is undertaken. But as technology advances, the costs go down. As we start to see the features come into play, a lot of it might be legacy that's already there, resident. It's just a matter of bringing that in and leveraging the vehicles that the state already has to other types of technologies.
We're hoping it can be done in a way that's decentralized. I mean, we have technology today that we didn't have in the past where you can really create a decentralized database rather than having to go through a central source.
Right now, there's no plans for a centralized metadata type database held at DHS or anything like that. In fact, there is a number of checks that are done today. You know, are you wanted? Have you had a speeding ticket? Things like that. Those checks are already underway.
There's some people that still say that we need a centralized pointer where we have a centralized centralized record for everyone involved. We don't think that that's technologically the case at this point, that states can bounce off each other and share information with each other without going through a centralized system held at the federal government.
But at the end of the day, nothing in the rule, nothing in the final plan, and nothing we're headed towards will build a centralized database.
The nice thing about this is that the control of this is still at the states. There is a major cultural change that's going to have to be undertaken, awareness out there to each of the states, because basically the DMVs and AMFA and the people that sponsor this, basically the whole purpose of driver's license is for safety of the highways. And so now what we're asking them to do is to take a little tweak to that and say, let's keep that as a core purpose of the driver's license. However, we need to have these processes in the background here to double check and to do other things to validate and to verify.
The driver's license for safety on the roads has begun to be accepted across America for a lot of other things, whether it's renting a car or a truck and driver's licenses have been used as a weapon for a terrorist. If you tie those two things together, the federal government has an absolute requirement, as pointed out by the 911 Commission, to get involved and set the minimum standards so that when that document is used, you are who you say you are, and it's a valid identification of you.
At the end of the day, I think, and maybe we can wrap up a fascinating conversation with this, I think it's a great example of what the American people and even people in this region sometimes don't see, which is the best of the private sector coming together with the public sector for a critical need of the country. And that is increasingly how we are going to meet the national security and other needs of the country, the best of the private with the public sector.
Well, I mean, we go to the private sector because big government is just very inefficient because of the rules we create. The reality is, in big government, we spend so much money making sure nobody can steal anything, and you can't do much anything else either. It just becomes easier to outsource a lot of these, which are not part of government's main business core anyway. So we're going to continue to see this, and the private sector continues to be very innovative.
With that, thank you all very much for a great conversation.